He's not the kind of kid we build programs around. Dale Coburn said it the way people say things they've decided not to feel bad about. Put him on equipment. Keep him out of the showcase. The head instructor didn't lower his voice. One hand gestured toward the 18-year-old standing at the center of the welding bay, the one who'd just laid the cleanest bead any of them had seen from a first-year student. He doesn't fit the profile we're presenting to the donors tonight. So they moved Ezra Colt to the back room. They gave his demonstration slot to a kid from the suburbs whose angles were crooked and whose hands shook under pressure. They told Ezra's mother to keep him out of the main hall, and his mother, who cleaned the offices of the very building they were standing in, nodded and said yes, because 11 years of watching what happened to people who said no had taught her exactly what yes cost and what no cost more. They thought they had contained him. They had no idea what happens when the steadiest hands in the room finally decide to stop being invisible. The Kellerman Technical Institute sat at the edge of the industrial district like something the city had put there and then politely forgotten. It was a brick building with tall factory windows and floors that smelled of machine oil and metal dust, and on the afternoon before the annual donor showcase, the low winter light came through those windows in long pale lines across the concrete. The Institute ran workforce programs for young people from the neighborhoods the city's glossy brochures called underserved, which was the word people used when they meant poor and didn't want to say so. Once a year, the Institute gathered its board members and its major donors and a handful of industry contacts and let them see for an evening where their charitable investments had gone. This year, the Institute had gone a step further. They'd invited representatives from Harwell Manufacturing, a firm with 3 regional facilities and a reputation for growing its own talent through apprenticeships that paid real wages and led somewhere. The kind of somewhere that didn't usually come knocking on the doors of streets like the ones Ezra Colt had grown up on. Ezra was 18, lean and dark-skinned, with his grandfather's patience in his hands and something else in his eyes that went very still when he worked. The way the rest of him stepped aside to let the concentration through. He had come to Kellerman 6 months ago on a partial scholarship his mother had spent 2 years applying for and 1 year waiting on. He had never welded before the first day of orientation. He had taken to it the way some people take to a language they didn't know they already spoke. His instructor, a compact woman named June Harwell, who wore her gray hair in a short braid and had spent 20 years in fabrication, before she started teaching it, had told the program coordinator 3 weeks into the semester that Ezra was the most naturally gifted student she had worked with in her time at Kellerman. His seams were even. His heat control was intuitive. He understood metal the way musicians understood pitch, not by formula but by feel. That was why she had put him at the center of the showcase plan. That was why on the afternoon of the event, when the program coordinator Dale Coburn came through the welding bay to review the demonstration lineup, she had to explain to him twice that the student she'd scheduled to lead the live weld was not a mistake. Dale Coburn ran the Institute's development office. He was a trim man in his late 50s who wore quarter-zip sweaters and spoke about the program's impact in the same smooth, rehearsed way he spoke about everything, as though all of life were a grant proposal. He had been at Kellerman for 4 years and had never once, to June's knowledge, watched a student actually work. He looked at Ezra across the welding bay for a long moment. He looked at the demonstration setup. He looked back at his clipboard. "I hear you on the technical side," he said, keeping his voice low and collegial. The way people keep their voices when they are about to say something they know won't sound good out loud. But tonight is about optics as much as outcomes. The Harwell people, the board members, they're going to be reading the room. We need the room to say a certain thing. June asked him what thing exactly the room needed to say. Dale didn't answer that directly. He had a way of not answering directly that had been refined to an art form. He walked out onto the floor while the students were running through the afternoon practice session, and he stopped the whole bay with a single raised hand, and the grinders went quiet, and the torches came down because he had stopped them. "Great work, everyone," he said. and his voice was warm, almost paternal, which was what made it so effective. We're going to make a few adjustments to tonight's presentation. Just some sequencing. Trevon, you'll anchor the live demonstration. Ezra, I'd like you on equipment management. You'll be essential support for the whole event. Equipment management. It meant standing at the back of the room, making sure the tools were laid out correctly and the safety shields were in their racks. For a moment, Ezra didn't move. June Harwell started to speak, and Dale turned the collegial smile on her, and she closed her mouth because she understood the math of it, and the math was that her contract was up for renewal in the spring. Trevon Wilkes came forward looking like he wanted to say something and couldn't find where to put it. Ezra stepped back and back again until he was at the edge of the student group and then past it, and the demonstration lineup rearranged itself around the space where he'd stood as though he'd never been there. It was done so smoothly that for a moment, nobody was certain anything had happened. There was no confrontation in it, no raised voice. Just a man in a quarter-zip sweater adjusting a room. Dale's gaze moved over Ezra once more, over the worn work jacket, the safety glasses pushed up on his forehead, the hands that had just run the cleanest bead in the building. Whatever calculation ran behind his eyes concluded somewhere that did not look like recognition. He looked toward the hallway where the support staff moved between the main hall and the back rooms, and it was Lorraine Colt who appeared when he looked, because Lorraine worked the building's facilities crew and was always where she was supposed to be, and she had not yet understood what she was being called toward. "Your son is enrolled, right?" Dale said. "Not really a question. He's doing really well, from what I hear." He said this looking past her, toward his clipboard. "But we're going to have him in a support role tonight, back near the equipment bay, away from the main floor during the donor presentations. We want the evening to have a particular flow. I'm sure you understand how these things work." Lorraine understood. She had spent her adult life understanding exactly how these things worked. She felt the hallway go narrow. She looked at her son standing at the edge of the welding bay with his chin level, and his expression controlled in the way he had learned to control it, and she felt something in her chest, close quietly along a seam she'd thought had healed. She could have said something. For one full second, she let herself imagine saying it. Imagine turning to Dale Coburn and telling him that her son had just run a weld that none of his instructors could have done at his age, that the Harwell people were going to leave this building tonight without ever knowing what they'd missed, that the story he was arranging so carefully for the donors was a lie assembled out of fear. Then she did the arithmetic she had been doing her whole life, the rent, the scholarship, which was partial and which the Institute could pull. The way she had watched more than once, what happened to people like her who lifted their voices at people like Dale in buildings like this. They did not win, they were simply removed, and quieter people took their places, and the building went on as though it had never learned their names. "Of course," she said, "I understand." She found Ezra near the corridor that connected the welding bay to the equipment storage room, where the fluorescent lights ran on a motion sensor and sometimes cut out when you stood too still. She took him by both arms, turned him so his back was to the hallway. "Look at me," she said low. "Ezra, look at me." "He can't do that," Ezra said. His voice was flat in the way his voice got when the thing was too large for volume. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just working. I know." Her hands tightened on his arms. "You're right. You did everything right. And I need you to hear me anyway." She held his gaze. "Some rooms, when you walk toward them, the door doesn't open. It falls on you. I have seen it happen more times than I can count, and I am not going to stand here and watch it happen to you. So I just disappear. Tonight," Lorraine said. "Tonight you step back because tonight stepping back keeps both of us standing tomorrow." She reached up and pressed her palm briefly to the side of his face, the way she had when he was small and the world had been smaller. "It is not because you are less. It is the opposite. You are worth too much to break yourself against one man in one building over one night." Ezra didn't answer right away. His jaw worked the way it did when he was holding something in. He reached into the pocket of his work jacket, and his hand closed around what he always kept there, A small steel washer, old and dark with age. His grandfather had given it to him the summer before the old man passed, told him it had come off the first piece of heavy equipment Luther Colt had ever repaired. A tractor on a farm in Georgia in 1959. When a black man keeping expensive machinery running was the only job that let him eat, and the only thing they couldn't quite take away because nobody else could do it as well. That washer was the only inheritance Luther had left. Not a house, not money, a trade, and the proof that it had been real. Ezra closed his fist around it. "Okay," he said. "Okay." Lorraine pressed her forehead briefly to his and then stepped back because someone was moving in the hallway, and being seen standing there too long was its own kind of cost. They put him in the equipment bay. It was a long, narrow room behind the main welding floor, lit by industrial overheads that buzzed faintly, lined with racks of torches and masks and coiled cables. He could hear the main hall on the other side of the wall beginning to fill as the evening came down and the donors arrived. The particular sound of a great many people who had never once been handed a defective piece of equipment and told to figure it out on their own. Ezra sat on a supply crate. He still had the washer in his hand. He turned it over and over. The way you work a worry stone when working it is all that's left. He could hear the demonstration going through its early phases, the sound of the presentation, the polished voice of the master of ceremonies walking the donors through the program's history and outcomes and graduation rates. And through the wall he could hear when the welding demonstrations began, each student at their station, the crowd's polite applause, landing at the expected moments, and his hands at his sides kept trying to move into position from 6 months of trained instinct, kept preparing to receive metal that wasn't coming. He knew every moment in that demonstration. He had run it 40 times in practice. His body had memorized it the way a musician memorizes a piece of music, not note by note but whole as a shape. Out beyond the wall, the lights came up warm and bright for everyone but him. He did not know yet that the same evening that had pushed him into the back was about to need him to come out of it. On the other side of the wall, time moved the way it does when you're not in the place you're supposed to be. In the main hall, it was an evening of introductions and pledges, of brochures and handshakes, and the careful maintenance of impressions. In the equipment bay, it was just Ezra and the buzzing lights and the washer growing warm in his hand. He had thought he understood what tonight was supposed to be. He had pictured it enough times on the bus home from evening sessions. Turning it over in the quiet way he turned over things he wanted, and didn't know how to say he wanted. The Harwell people were here. He knew what an apprenticeship from a firm like that could mean. Not just a job, but a credential, a reference, a reason someone in a position to hire would pick up the phone on his behalf. He had come from a block where credentials were not assumed, where the pathway between working hard and being seen for it had a gap in it that looked small on paper and was a canyon in practice. He had thought that doing the work well enough might be enough to close the gap. It hadn't been enough. That was what he kept turning over in the back room, not that he'd been reassigned, but that being genuinely, demonstrably good had not shielded him at all. The skill his grandfather had given him the blueprint for, the thing their family had carried when there was nothing else portable, and a man with a clipboard had looked at it and decided it didn't photograph right. So, what was it worth? What was any of it worth if the door came down on you, regardless of how clean your seams were? He didn't hear the man come in until he was already through the door. He was older, maybe 65, with the deliberate movements of someone who had spent decades working in spaces where haste caused injury. His hands were marked by years of physical work in the way hands either are or aren't, and he wore a facilities badge that put him in the same crew as Lorraine. He set a box down near the rack with the kind of careful economy that meant he had carried things worth taking care of for a very long time. He looked at Ezra and did not look surprised to find him there. "Equipment duty," he said. "Not a question. Told I don't fit the presentation," Ezra said. The bitterness came out before he could decide whether to let it. The man made a sound low in his chest, the kind of sound that had a whole history in it. He pulled a stool over from the corner and lowered himself onto it. "Quinlan Marsh," he said, and extended a hand that was large and careful. I run facilities nights and weekends. Been here 6 years. Ezra shook his hand. Ezra Colt, I know who you are. Quinlan nodded toward the wall. Your mother talks about you. Good woman. Steadiest person in this building, you ask me, and most people here wouldn't think to. He looked at the wall for a moment as though he could see through it to the hall beyond. Heard you working a few weeks back through this wall. Stopped what I was doing. Ezra's throat tightened. Lot of good it did me. Quinlan didn't answer right away. When he spoke again, his voice had gone somewhere further back, to a different room, a different building, a different version of himself. I had a skill once, he said. Not like yours, but close enough to recognize it. Sheet metal, fabrication, same family of work. I was good at it in my 20s in a way that doesn't just come from practice. The kind of good where the people who know, they stop and watch. He turned the memory over, and every time it came to the moment to walk into a room and say, here I am, this is what I can do, look at this thing I made, I found a reason to stand back. The wrong time, the wrong room. People like me don't push in spaces like that. I told myself patience was strategy. I told myself the right moment was coming. I told myself I was protecting what I had. He paused. Was it worth it? Ezra asked. Quinlan looked at his hands. At the knuckles, the calluses, the evidence of decades of careful work done in rooms where nobody asked his name. I'm 63 years old, he said slowly, and I have kept every machine in every building I ever worked in running perfectly, and not one person in any of those buildings would be able to tell you a thing I made, because I never made anything that was mine to show. He looked up. Staying back feels like safety, but it has a price. Every day you pay it in something you don't get back, some version of yourself that you decided wasn't worth the risk of being seen. He stood, picked up his box, and moved toward the door with the unhurried certainty of a man who had been where he was going many times before. I'm not telling you what to do. You're young and it's not my place. He paused at the door without turning back. I'm only telling you what I know. And then he was gone. And Ezra sat with what he'd said pressing against the inside of his chest like heat against metal, and the buzzing of the overhead lights was the only sound. He wasn't alone long. The door opened and a student came through it fast, checking behind him as he came. It was Marcus Webb, who ran stations 2 spots down from where Ezra used to stand in the Bay lineup, who'd ridden the same eastbound bus home more than once, and split a meal at the vending machine in the hallway between late sessions when both of them were running short. I've been looking for you, Marcus said, dropping his voice. This is messed up, Ezra. Everybody knows it. Everybody saw. Then why didn't anybody say anything? It came out harder than he meant it to. Marcus's face fell, and the answer was already written there before he said a word. Because half of us are only here because the scholarship covers what our families can't, and if the program director decides we're trouble, that's it. My cousin got cut from a program like this for less. You know how it works. We all just. He stopped, looked at the floor. We froze. All of us. I'm sorry. I should have said something when it happened, and I just stood there. And there it was, not one man with a clipboard. A whole structure built so that everyone had a personal, specific, financially grounded reason to stay quiet, so that the machinery of exclusion never had to be loud because everyone standing in it had already agreed to lower their voices. Marcus was not a bad person. Marcus was a 19-year-old whose family needed the same thing Ezra's family needed. It's not your fault, Ezra said, and he meant it. Marcus glanced at the door. They've got Trevon out front for the live demonstration. The big one, the one the Harwell guys are actually here to see. His voice dropped lower. Ezra, he's struggling. You've watched him in practice. He rushes the heat when he's nervous, and his seams blow. I know. The Harwell guys are going to see a bad weld, the whole point of tonight. I know, Ezra said again, quietly. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then he squeezed his arm once, hard. I gotta get back before they notice I'm gone. Whatever you decide, I'm with you. We all are. We're just scared. Then the door closed and Ezra was alone again. Through the wall, the program had moved into its final phase. He could track it from memory. The same sequence they'd rehearsed, the same order. He knew the live demonstration was the showcase's centerpiece, the segment the donors came to see, the moment the Institute pointed at and said, This is what a year of instruction produces. He knew the timing. He knew the material. His hands had run through the required weld so many times they could have done it in the dark. And he could hear, through the wall, that something had gone wrong. The rhythm of the demonstration had broken. There was a pause where there shouldn't be one, then the low consulting voices of instructors, then the pause again. The welding equipment had been started and stopped. The crowd had gone from the steady murmur of an engaged audience to a different quality of silence. The kind of silence that forms when people in a room begin to realize simultaneously that the thing they came to see is not going to happen the way they were promised. Ezra stood up. He had heard that silence before, from the other side of it. He knew what it was like to be inside it, the way panic narrowed everything down to the single moment you couldn't move past. He moved to the door and looked through the narrow pane of reinforced glass set into it. He could see across the welding floor to the main demonstration station, where Trevon was standing with his helmet pushed back and his hands visibly unsteady. And the two Harwell representatives were standing to one side of the donor group, consulting quietly with each other. And Dale Coburn was near the back of the room with his arms crossed and his face doing something complicated. And June Harwell was by the equipment table, and she was looking not at Trevon but at the door to the equipment bay, looking at it the way you look at a thing you need. Trevon's hands went to the torch. He got his helmet down. He moved to start the bead and stopped. He stood there for a moment with the equipment in his hands and all the instruction in his head and none of it connecting, the way it doesn't connect when the room is too loud behind your eyes. And then he stepped back from the station without having done anything, and the space he left was the most expensive empty space in the building. Ezra thought about Quinlan's voice. Every day you pay in something you don't get back. He thought about his mother's forehead pressed to his. You are worth too much to break over one man in one building. He thought about Marcus's hand on his arm. Whatever you decide, I'm with you. He thought about his grandfather on a farm in Georgia in 1959, keeping a tractor running that nobody else could fix, doing the work so completely and so exactly that the work itself became the argument, the thing they couldn't quite take away because the evidence was there in the metal. He did not decide the way you decide a hard thing with a long deliberation. The decision had been made somewhere below the part of him that deliberated. There was a demonstration that needed to happen. He was the person in this building who could make it happen. And to stay in the back room now would be to agree one more time that the version of him worth seeing was the version that stayed invisible. He closed his hand around the washer. He pushed open the door. He crossed the welding floor in his worn work jacket. No presentation clothes, nothing that looked like it belonged in the front of the room. He walked past the outer edge of the student group and past the donor tables and past the Harwell representatives without looking at any of them. And he could feel every assumption arrive in the room the moment they saw him. A facilities kid, someone thought. Equipment support, someone else, dark-skinned, young, dressed wrong, moving into a space he had not been arranged into. He walked to the demonstration station. He did not look at Dale Coburn. He did not announce himself. He pulled his safety glasses down from his forehead to his eyes, picked up the torch, and he ran the bead. The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. What came off that station in the next 4 minutes was not a student demonstration. It was the thing June Harwell had tried to tell Dale Coburn about, and Dale Coburn had decided did not fit the picture. It was the thing Quinlan Marsh had heard through a wall and stopped moving to listen to. The seam Ezra ran was straight and even and controlled at every point of transition, the heat managed with the particular accuracy that is either natural or it isn't, and what the room saw was a young man who was not performing competence, but simply, plainly, undeniably having it. By the doors that led to the main corridor, Lorraine Colt had gone still. She had been moving between the kitchen and the donor tables with a service tray, when she heard the quality of the room change. When the murmur went away and the held breath attention came in to replace it, and her head had come up the way it did when a sound meant something. And then she saw her son at the demonstration station, in front of every donor and board member and industry contact in the building, in the slot that Dale Coburn had specifically removed him from. The tray in her hands tilted. She steadied it. For Lorraine in that instant it was not yet a victory. She had spent too many years learning the cost of visibility to feel it as a victory before the evidence was in. She watched the room the way she always watched rooms, reading the temperature of it, and what she read was not what she had braced for. The two Harwell representatives had moved. They had shifted from the position they'd held at the side of the room to the position people take when they want a closer look at something that has caught their complete attention. One of them had taken a phone from his jacket pocket and put it away again without using it. The other was watching Ezra's hands with the specific focus of a person who recognizes craft and is recalibrating something they had already decided. The donors had gone the kind of quiet that costs nothing to perform and everything to produce. Not polite silence, actual silence. The kind that forms when people who have sat through 100 presentations realize they are watching something that is not a presentation. And through it all, Ezra did not acknowledge the room. He completed the weld the way he completed every weld, as if the metal were the only thing in the space, as if the seam were a thing that deserved his full attention regardless of who was watching or not watching, and this absolute absorption in the work itself was what went through the hall like a current. Not showmanship, not defiance. Just a person who was so entirely capable that capability was the only thing visible. When the bead was finished, he set the torch down in its rest and pushed his safety glasses back up. The room, for one beat, was completely still. Then someone in the donor group started it, and inside 5 seconds the room was on its feet. It was not the programmed applause of an audience following a cue. It was the spontaneous, slightly startled applause of people who had come to see something and had not expected to feel something, and the distinction was audible. People were talking already, turning to each other, pointing. The Harwell representatives were not applauding. They were talking to each other in the low-focused way of people making decisions. June Harwell crossed the floor. She didn't say anything. She looked at the seam, at the tool placement, at the whole setup, and she looked at Ezra with an expression that had no management in it, no professional distance. She was just a woman who had spent 20 years in this field looking at a piece of work that confirmed something she had already known and had not been allowed to use. "You didn't have to do it that way," she said quietly. "Yes, I did," Ezra said. She held his gaze for a moment and then nodded once, the way people nod at things they recognize as true. Near the back of the room, Dale Coburn had not moved from where he was standing. The evening he had arranged so precisely had not just failed to go according to plan. It had rearranged itself completely around the person he had specifically removed from the center of it, in front of every individual whose opinion he had been managing all year. The picture he had built was gone, and in its place was a different picture entirely, one that made the first one look like what it had been. The board chairman, a retired engineer named Lowell Briggs, who had helped found the program and who had a particular impatience for the gap between what institutions claimed and what they delivered, came off the donor floor and made his way to where Dale was standing. The exchange between them was brief, and it was not loud, and it did not need to be. He did not threaten. He asked 3 questions, all of which were about process, and Dale answered them, and the answers were their own indictment laid out in real time in front of the man who signed off on the program's annual review. Lowell Briggs was not a man who expressed anger. He expressed interest in accountability, and tonight his interest was very particular. He moved on and found June Harwell and spoke with her for a long time, and she did not spare the details. Across the hall, the older of the 2 Harwell representatives had made his way to where Ezra was standing near the demonstration station, still in his work jacket, the washer back in his pocket. The man introduced himself as someone who ran apprenticeship development for the firm's regional operations. He did not make a speech. He told Ezra simply that he'd been watching skilled fabricators for a long time in a lot of contexts, and what he'd just seen was not a student demonstration. He asked whether Ezra had ever considered where he wanted to be in 5 years, and whether the answer included working with metal. "That's all I've been thinking about," Ezra said. "I just couldn't get anyone to look at it." The representative nodded. "Well," he said, "consider yourself looked at." He handed Ezra a card and told him to expect a call the following week from their program coordinator, and then he made his way back across the floor toward his colleague. Ezra stood holding the card. He had not let go of the station's edge with his other hand. Across the hall, Lorraine was still by the kitchen corridor. The tray was set down now. She had both hands clasped in front of her, and she was watching her son across the length of the room with an expression that had moved through fear and through relief and through something older and harder to name. Pride was part of it. But the larger part was the particular feeling of watching someone you raised walk through a door you had spent years teaching them not to open, and realizing that you had been wrong about the door, not wrong to be careful, not wrong to know the cost, but wrong about whether the cost was always the same. When the hall had quieted and the donors had begun making their way out and the students had started the work of breaking down the stations, Ezra found Lorraine in the kitchen where she had retreated to finish the end-of-event tasks that still needed doing. She was at the counter restacking trays, and she turned when he came in and then stopped turning and just looked at him. He crossed the room and she put her arms around him, and for a long time neither of them said anything. "When I saw you walk out there," she said finally into the shoulder of his work jacket, "my first thought was that we'd lost everything. I went through the whole arithmetic in about 4 seconds. I saw the scholarship gone. I saw the letter. I saw us scrambling." Her arms tightened. "And then I watched the room, and it wasn't what I thought it would be." "It might not have gone the other way," Ezra said. "I know," she said. "I know that. And you still went." She pulled back enough to look at his face. "Your grandfather would have walked out there. I know he would have. He walked into rooms his whole life that told him he didn't belong there. And he brought his work with him, and he let the work do the talking. I had just spent so long being careful that I forgot he raised me to know the difference between careful and invisible." "You kept us okay," Ezra said. "For a long time. That matters. It does. And it isn't everything." She reached up and touched his jacket pocket, the slight weight of the washer beneath the fabric. "You kept that thing with you the whole time?" "Always," he said. She pressed her palm flat against his chest for a moment, over the pocket, over the washer inside it, and her eyes filled. "It's the only thing that's ours," she said. "Then I'm going to make it worth something," he said. The call came 8 days later. The apprenticeship coordinator from Harwell Manufacturing, straightforward and specific. A 2-year program with a wage that was more than Lorraine had ever made in a single year, leading to a full-time placement at one of the firm's regional facilities. The kind of offer that did not come through the front door of the block Ezra had grown up on. June Harwell was removed from her contract negotiation cycle and placed on a multi-year agreement, which was the institution's way of acknowledging that it had nearly thrown away the most valuable thing it had. Dale Coburn's role was restructured in the spring in ways the press release described as an organizational evolution, and that everyone inside the building understood differently. Lowell Briggs, in his remarks at the following year's board meeting, said that the Institute's most important asset was not its equipment, or its curriculum, or its relationships with industry partners. It was the students who came through the door from streets that had never sent anyone through that kind of door before. He said this looking at a framed photograph on the wall behind the podium, one the Institute's communications team had asked permission to use, of a young man at a demonstration station with safety glasses and a worn work jacket, running a bead in front of a room full of people who had not been expecting what they were seeing. None of the larger things arrived in a single evening. They arrived the way real things arrive, through phone calls and paperwork and early morning bus rides to a facility on the south side of the district, earned in increments, one session at a time. But on the night itself, after the building had emptied and the overhead lights in the equipment bay were running on their motion sensors again, and the last of the staff had gone to their cars, Ezra walked back through the welding bay one more time. He stopped at the demonstration station. He looked at the seam from that evening, still visible on the practice plate. He took the washer out of his pocket. He set it on the plate next to the seam, next to the evidence of what he'd made. The two things side by side. The thing that had been passed down, and the thing he had laid down in a room full of people who had not thought he belonged there. He picked the washer back up. He put it in his pocket. He turned off the light and he walked out of the building into the cold, clear night. And somewhere behind him was a back room where he'd been told to wait, and where he had decided, simply and without drama, not to. And somewhere ahead, a facility with his name expected in it, a room full of serious work waiting to be done by hands that had always been capable of doing it, waiting only for the night someone was finally allowed to look.